So, and we are set. All right. Thank you again for doing this. Would you please take just a second and tell us about your journey as a writer and, what you're doing now, but what led you to that?
Well, I think I always wanted to be a writer. At certain points, I thought journalism would be a practical choice, and I did that on and off when I was quite young, and at the same time was always writing stories. And in a sense, I worked in the summers in New Jersey when I was in college as a reporter, and I kept seeing things that needed more thought and depth and time, really, in response. I could write the article, I could cover it, but I found I was still thinking about things a year later, trying to understand what made the people tick and so on. And I really could see that fiction was the way for me to do that, to be able to explore what I really wanted to think about. And so I did go to graduate school and got an MFA quite young, but then I worked. I worked a whole bunch of crazy temp jobs for a while writing, which was also an education and a good education, and began to publish. And at a certain point, I was publishing short stories and reviews, and I got hired to teach. I hadn't really expected to want to teach, but I really loved it. So I've really been teaching creative writing and writing mostly fiction, some nonfiction, essays and reviews and so on, and editing. I'm doing a lot of editing. So I've edited a number of journals. I've edited anthologies and things like that. And,
excellent. I want to go back to something you said before we move. I want to go back to something you said before we move on, and that is your writing articles, doing journalism, did not give you the time, space to explore, to go as deep as you wanted to spend as long as you wanted to, and fiction does afford that. So my question to you is, still today, does most of your fiction arise from real life events you're involved in, witness, that kind of thing that you take and explore? Or was that just early on? And
even then, I don't think I intended to write, because I could have written long-form nonfiction if it was going to really be that. It was more that I would be, and it's still true, you don't need to be a journalist for this, you just encounter people and their lives and experiences, and some piece of that enters your imagination, and you want to brood on it, really, and understand it. So it wasn't a matter of accurately depicting the precise events, but more, I think, just naturally being a fiction writer, things would spark, and I would go off and be making up a background for it, which would not be appropriate for journalism, but was very appropriate for fiction.
Right. Great. So you're an excellent writer, and I have enjoyed so many of your stories over the years. I think of you, and this could be just because of my limited exposure, but I think of you as primarily a short story writer. But is that how you think of yourself? And if so, whether or not, tell us about your sort of writing and publishing career over the years, and if I'm right about what I'm saying, and if someone listening is a short story writer, what do you recommend they do?
Well, I think I'm a short story reader too, to be honest. So whenever there's one of those, thinking about what are the things that influenced you, there clearly are novels that did, but there's a lot of short stories that did. And I think I don't consider myself limited to the short story.
Sure.
And I've written some very long stories that are novella and that's a lot in recent years. So clearly I may be working my way, along to another thing. But I do like the tale. I like a fully shaped story that is very concentrated in a way, and often plays with the form too, to use sometimes sections or things like that. There's a story in my most recent book, Magpies, that's it covers a hurricane season, and each paragraph starts with the next letter of the alphabet, so it sort of mimics the way a hurricane season is constructed with a kind of imaginary alphabet of storms. And, I just find myself continuing to be very interested in that form. But I am also writing quite a bit of pieces of memoir these days, and those would be linked by one kind of, they're pieces, so they're sort of like nonfiction short stories, but there is a continuing kind of narrative in that. So that's another thing I'm doing.
Gotcha. Did your first stories appear in journals, publications, and then gathered later?
Literary magazines to begin with, and I was pretty lucky pretty early, and I had a story in Redbook when Redbook was still a venue with a lot of short stories in it, and then I had a story that won the Edgar Award for Best Mystery Story, and so, you know, I think that in general, short stories don't pay, but I started having people asking me to write stories for anthologies particularly, so I've done that quite a bit, as well as publishing in literary magazines and commercial magazines.
The award that you mentioned, did you see that opened up those doors, those invitations started coming more after you received that?
Yeah, the story itself had appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, which is obviously a commercial magazine for mystery short fiction, and a really top one that has people, you know, really lots of big names are in there and so on. So just to even get the story accepted there, to me, seemed an enormous big deal,
yes.
Breakthrough. And then the fact that I then, I'm sure there must have been some people miffed, because it just went on to win the Edgar Award. So that put me in a certain kind of footing. And I suppose that the shrewd thing to do would have been to sit down and write a mystery novel, but I just kind of, I think I took the other message. Oh, I can write any kind of short story, and maybe people will like it. So I have done some that have a bit of the uncanny or fantasy, and more that have had crime of one sort or another, suspense, mystery, and then lots that are straight, as we like to say, straight fiction, which is kind of a stupid term, actually. But, you know, traditionally, you know, not in a genre of fiction.
And so tell us about you have a few different collections of stories that people can find. Will you tell us about those titles and where they can be found?
Sure. I published 3 books of short stories, and I believe that the first one, The Land of Go, is now out of print. But the second one, The Secret Names of Women, and the most recent one, Magpies, are both in print from Carnegie Mellon, and you could get them through your local independent bookstore if you've got one, and you can certainly get them on Amazon. They're not ebooks, though. I also co-edited a collection of James M. Cain's nonfiction, which is still in print and I think still is kind of a collector's item nonetheless. And I co-edited a collection with Kristen Kovacic of writing by men and women about pregnancy, birth, adoption, and the beginning of being a parent, about the birth of a parent, basically.
Nice.
And that is called Birth, a Literary Companion, and that was from Iowa Press.
Nice. So tell me your process. First of all, do you have certain writerly routines that you adhere to when you're writing? Do you have a certain schedule? And then beyond that, what your typical process is?
I think, well, first of all, I write pretty much always very early in the morning. I try to do that every day. There are days when it's impossible with travel or something, but, you know, I get up early and write when it's quiet. And once I had a child, I got up even earlier in order for it to have it be quiet, so it got kind of reinforced. But it varies through the year because I am teaching, so I don't teach in the summer, so I can go on much longer and write, you know, longer into the day than I might be able to do, or I can stop, do something else, and go back, and we'll write in the afternoon. But usually during the school year, the afternoon is pretty difficult. And in terms of process, I am I like to start with bits and pieces very often, and I always have grabbed one to show. Small notebooks, very small, you know, very easy to throw around and beat up, and I will just jot things down, no matter what time of day or night it might be, that strike me. And what will happen, I find, is that things start to adhere to each other, and I've started to think of something as a story. So maybe at first it was just an idea, and maybe there was some other observation, which would be like that real life kind of observation we were talking about, and maybe a memory, and then I start to draw possibly some kind of map of the location or a sketch of a place or something like that. And at a certain point, I have enough stuff that I feel kind of confidence that it's worth moving over to the more official kind of writing. And then I start to try to work on a real draft and work on scenes and, so forth. I'll continue, obviously, to make notes, but I'll go through these notebooks. And the thing is, there's several going in different places. So I have to pull together 4 notebooks or something and go, okay, this belongs, that belongs. Along the way, I rediscover other things I wrote as notes that I wasn't really remembering. And sometimes I'll see that they also really are part of the same thing. And then I start to have drafts and to revise. And often I set it aside at some point to cook a little, because usually there's something I'm knocking my head against that seems not quite right. And I'll meanwhile be working on another thing that has arisen from the notes. So I usually have a number of things that are on my computer that are not done, but I've worked on them a lot, and I can go back to them and often, and then I can finish them because now I understand them better.
Do you consider when you finish something and go to something else, is it a draft? Is it a complete draft? Or are you actually working on a couple of different stories at one time in sort of that first draft?
I try to get to sort of a complete draft before I turn my attention to something else, but it might have problems, it might have gaps, it might have 2 of something. Like I wrote one scene that was maybe a confrontation, and then I thought, maybe there's this other one, and I'll put it all in there. So it's sort of got a lot of material, but it's got raggedy edges. And so what do we call that, a draft? I think so. I tend not to want to polish, as I go all the way through. I'd rather that it were raggedy so that I get a lot in, and then I can think about it. And I do polish a lot then after that, and I think, I find people think that that's how the sentences come out of me, but that is not correct. People will assume that because you've done a lot of work, because I don't think I've ever published anything that didn't have a lot of layers of work in it, that, when you sit down, it's just coming out that way, and it's definitely not.
Right. So tell me about your teaching, and what are the most common mistakes or issues your students have in their writing that stand out and reoccur?
Teach everything these days, everything from undergraduates who would have had maybe one intro to creative writing, and then they might be in their first real all-fiction class, on up through graduate students who would be in an MFA program and very serious about what they're doing. And I teach a lot at conferences as well. So I'm teaching, and I should say our graduate program has a big range of ages and experiences, which is something I really love about it, is that people are not all, 22 and only preoccupied with exactly the same things. There's just a great diversity. And conferences I really enjoy also teaching at, because people, again, are coming from a lot of different backgrounds. So some things I see is that people think that they can rush and write a draft. That's fine, they can rush and write a draft, but that they must honor exactly where they began, for instance, so that they're in love with the beginning, and because they're so grateful it got written, and things like that, and they're not really able to rethink the story because they don't feel confident enough generally, and often they really do need to rethink it. So a lot of what I try to teach is a kind of an attitude towards and strategies for revision, to understand that maybe what you really need to know is what is really the best thing in the story. There's a Raymond Chandler quote that I really like that talks about, it's kind of a long quote, it's in his letters, but he talks about there's a first draft, and then what you're just trying to find is what is it that really gets up and stands on its own 2 feet and is alive, and you should throw everything else away and start revising sort of outward from that. And I think that's something I try to exemplify, and I try to help people have conversations about that when they're workshopping, so that they're not saying, I really hate this and you should change that, as if it were an almost done thing and you were just going to change this tiny bit, because really you're trying to train for going on to do more things as well. So what is it that seems like the heart of this? What is it that seems like the place where we really care, and what made that happen, rather than what's the prettiest sentence or something like that. The most wonderful metaphor, something like that.
Excellent. So actually what you're talking about are maybe even editing, revising on a structural level.
On a structural level.
Finding the story that is hidden in the mess.
And also to help people see what their habits are. So there are habits people have that show up in a draft as a result of their process. So one thing that you'll see is that the beginning will be very heavy and slow and have lots of development and lots of description, and the end, then it starts to rush at the end. And so you can say, look, in the first, let's say it's a short story, in the first 5 pages, the character manages to get across a room and do one little thing, because there's so much thinking and background and so on in it. And in the last 5 pages, even the last 1 page, people are killing each other. Like, that's completely disproportionate. But what that is a picture of your energy and time. Because if you sit down to write in one stint, you're going to have much more energy and time at the beginning, and you're going to be rushing. And many of them do write in one stint. They're trying to do it all in one day, things like that. Because if they're students, they've got other classes. If they've got jobs, they've got other preoccupations. So to say, you really need to distribute your energy over the entire manuscript, whatever it might be. And so you need to understand that everything should get developed. And if anything, the reader wants it to start fast and slow down, the opposite. Or it might be that because people are inexperienced, they really can only write scenes with 2 people in them. And so you'll see a story and it has 2 people, like the main character and somebody else, the main character and somebody else. Maybe we get back to those first 2 people, but they haven't built up the ability from practice to write a big scene where all 4 of those people were on stage at the same time. And so that's another kind of structural understanding, which might lead you to go back and do some exercises just to practice that.
Excellent. Thank you. Would you share with us your thoughts, techniques on creating characters, bringing them to life? What you teach in your class about that, what you practice in doing it. Just sort of explore that for a moment.
Well,
character.
It's funny because character comes quite easily to me, that's kind of hard to say why, but it clearly was even very early on. I could start with characters. I try to keep people from making very flat characters that are good or bad, or strong or weak. And I would often try to have them do things like write a character biography with some emphasis on the fact that everybody has strengths, everybody has weaknesses, everybody has wounds, everybody has secrets. So I might give them a sheet with a bunch of questions, and one of the questions might be, what lie did your character most recently tell? And that automatically opens up the fact that humans are all going to do it. It might have been a very polite lie to protect somebody. It might have been another kind of lie. But to understand that we really want from characters that they have human complexity. And that's true. Even if a character is a very minor character and they're not really going to get to display all that, there's no small parts. It's up to the actors to pull it off. You still want that life, that vitality in there. Really great characters often have a tremendous sort of schism in them of, really strong contrast. And rather than write, on the one hand, he's that, on the other hand, he's that, which I see people doing a lot, it's more that you really want to enact the fact that they're not totally, smooth and controlled and so on, which I just think it's a kind of mask that people think that they should make. So I try to open that up. So often, again, in workshopping, I'll start asking, what if we read this story the other way? What if we read it with our sympathies reversed? Because usually the writer, the inexperienced writer, is trying to sort of make you be sympathetic to one person and show you what a horrible person, the husband is or something. And I'll say, so what if we took out all the sort of evaluative stuff and we tried to read it the other way? What would that do? How would we have to start to understand it, just to kind of enrich the sense of character?
That's great advice.
Lots of play, lots of being playful about it, I think.
Excellent. Your notebooks that you carry, do they have character observations and sort of psychological insights or things that you encounter?
I think all kinds of things like that. Sometimes just descriptions, just a detail. You're out someplace and having a cup of coffee and you see something and just write down that detail. Sometimes bits of speech that seem to me to be rich in, some not only character but situation. Something somebody said that kind of just in a phrase, you're kind of getting the whole bit of that. I'll write those down. And sometimes I'm trying to, because if I'm working on something in my mind, I'm trying to understand someone and what would make them do something or what they would do in a particular situation. So there's kind of speculative exploration that I would be writing in a notebook, yeah. And then also I tend to write lists of, what does somebody have in her pocketbook or what would be the right place for that kind of list. I'll be saying all the places that you could look at that would reveal character, what's in the trunk of somebody's car, what's hidden in the back of the closet, that kind of thing.
Could you, if I pulled your book off my shelf right now and picked one of the stories, how much information could you give me about the characters' lives prior to the start of the story and after its completion?
Lots. Are you going to test me?
No test.
No, lots, of course. And I think that's one of the things about, the short story can seem, I see short stories and they're published and some of them are by well-known writers, but they're flat in that respect, that you don't have that sense of there's more beyond the page. And I really do think we used to talk about minimalist writing, which was sort of like that. I think I'm a maximalist writer. I really want you to feel that, yes, there could be another, we could follow that character on and that character came from somewhere. And that we have gotten a full story, but that, I know, and so you can feel that there's more surrounding that.
Given that, have you ever revisited characters and had them in more than one story or in several stories?
I have, and in fact, in Magpies, there are 3 stories that center on the same couple, and I didn't plan to do that when I wrote the first one. I wrote the first one in which it's called Gift Wrap, and it's set at Christmas time, and it centers more on the woman and her family, who are all descending on their home because her mother's died, and so is she going to be the new center for Christmas? And I gave her a husband, and I explored his character a little bit, but it was not really about him. And then I published the story, and it actually got it was originally published in the Sun Sentinel, the Fort Lauderdale Sun Sentinel. It got anthologized in an anthology of Christmas stories from the South, and therefore I had to look at it again, and I was saying, how did those people ever meet? How did that couple get together? I mean, what's up with that? And so, because he had a very unusual kind of background, he was from Chile. He'd had lost all his family, which I probably made up in the first place, so his family wouldn't be at Christmas. But then, I'm like, what happened with that? And then I wrote a story about, it covers just one night where they're together and they've started to be lovers, but whether they're really going to have a future, they don't know. I knew, but I had to make it clear that they don't know, and I, sort of explore that. Wrote that story. That story was published, and then I wrote a third one that's set later. That's in his point of view, that's the hurricane story that I mentioned before. And am I done with them? I don't know. Are they done with me is really the question, because every once in a while they come knocking. And I have made other characters do cameo appearances in different stories. So I've sort of played with that a bit.
That's great. Excellent. Okay, so in conclusion, and again, thank you so much for doing this. Can you tell me what your what advice would you give to someone who is truly interested in producing fine work? Not just having a book out, or not just, but I mean, being a really good writer. If they said, hey, tell me something, give me something to help me be extraordinary or better than average, what would you say?
Well, you have to read, and the kind of work that you're hoping to write, you should read, and then you should reread it, I would say. I think that rereading and really, because you're reading it maybe and you're getting pleasure, but to go back and reread it and to reread it and to take it apart in various ways is the way to understand what it is that constructed that stories or novels or whatever, memoirs, excellence. And when I was starting out, there were writers whose work knocked me out, and I actually would retype passages and pages or hand rewrite them, trying to drive into not just my head, my whole self, what that was made of, really, I suppose. And I know people who have notebooks of just that, where they've copied passages and so on. I've often, broken something apart to understand the scenes and the choice for the scenes and the time. Somebody like Alice Munro, who's obviously just won the Nobel Prize and who's solely a short story writer, her stories are incredibly rich. And when you look, you can see that she knows the whole life, and she can make really amazing jumps. How does she get away with the amazing jump without losing you? You have to sit there and look at how that jump was set up. It's like a sport. If you saw somebody and they could, do an amazing kind of ski jump or something, they didn't just do that. They practice it, and it's in the takeoff, right? So you need to look at the takeoff too.
So with that in mind, what you just said, and thank you for sharing that, Saul Bellows said, I am a reader moved to emulation. Can you tell us who some of your largest, biggest influences are, who set you afire early on?
There's lots, but I know that early on, I certainly read a lot of the classics. I read Austen and Bronte and some women, Dickens. We didn't have a lot of books in our house when I was growing up, but I was a reader, and my father took me to the town library, which was a very small library, and got me an adult card when I was not yet old enough, and I began alphabetically. So I have a lot of memories for the A's, B's, C's.
Wow.
And I read a book by Colette, who is one of my favorite writers, but I'd never, of course, at that point heard of her. And I'd never really read anything that sophisticated before. And I went back to my hometown a couple years ago and went to the library, and that one book by her is still there. It's called The Ripening Seed. It's not really one of her best-known works or anything, but that exact edition is there. And I just thought, I said thank you to the book, because, it opened up a way that a book could be and a writing could be, which was not a traditional big, heavy narrative. It's much more impressionistic and point of view sort of driven and things like that. And the language, which was a translation, but a fabulous translation, was different than anything I'd experienced too. So, and I could name others, but I'm also on another side a fan of Poe and Stevenson and people who tell tales of certain kinds of extremes. So it's a variety of things that kind of are in the mix.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And,
can you tell?
Hello to everybody.
Can you tell people where they can find you online?
Yes, you can find. I'm on Twitter as Lynne Barrett, and I'm with an E in the Lynn. I have a website which is lynnebarrett.com, and on there you can see how to find me in a lot of other ways, all the conferences I do and other kinds of things. So I'm on Facebook with an author page also, Lynne Barrett. It's simple.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay. Thanks very much, Michael.